Ragnar, from Sweden to Norway. So I'm not going to ask if there are any Scandinavians here, because I think I got that answer. I'm going to be talking about the box. I'm going to be talking about a practical, process-oriented approach to game design, project management, scope control, except fuck that. That sounds very dry and dull and horribly uninteresting for a Saturday at 5 o'clock. Instead, I want to talk about the process of making games. How many here are game developers? Okay, how many are studying and hoping to become game developers? All right, cool. And how many are just players? Okay. Well, this might be interesting to you too as well, I hope. But I care deeply about making games, and those of you who are game developers probably care deeply about it as well. And I want to share that passion, my story, and hopefully inspire you to make better games and to tell your stories, because I want to listen to that and I want to hear that. And if I can do anything to help, then great. So I'm going to rewrite this a little bit and talk about telling my story and inspiring game creators, you guys, to create better games. And it just won't just be game stuff about process, but I'll talk a little bit about process as well. And I'm going to be talking about toilet paper. It's going to make sense. I'm also going to be talking about a box, obviously, and about running a brand new inexperienced studio, and about fumbling in the dark, and about a lot of different things. I'll go into a little bit more detail about who I am along the way, but my name is Ragnar. I run a game studio in Oslo, Norway called Red Thread Games. You can find me on Twitter. That's my Simpsons lookalike. I know that's like so 10 years ago to have your Simpsons character, but I've made a game called The Longest Journey, and I made a few other games too, but that's probably the game I'm best known for. It came out a long time ago, so I've been doing this for almost 25 years now, making games. I hope it doesn't show, but just to give you an example, that was me 5 years ago, that's me today. That's what happens when you run an indie game studio. It's soul-crushing, but it's also a lot of fun. So 5 years ago, I left basically AAA. I left a company called Funcom in Norway to start something new. And for the first time ever, I had complete freedom to do just whatever. But I also had full responsibility for everything, for every single person, for paying salaries, for making sure people had a job to come to and a project to work on. And that meant I had to change the way I thought about making games. When I worked at my previous job, I didn't really care about the practicalities of it. It was more about sort of creating the product and trying to stick to timelines, but not always doing that because the salaries were paid anyway. I didn't have that sense of responsibility. Starting a new studio meant that I had to really change the way I thought about it, the whole process of it. And if I didn't, then there wouldn't be any toilet paper. And this sounds like a stupid analogy, but this is one of the things I kept talking about. Like, I worked at a big studio for 18 years, and there was always toilet paper in the toilet. But when I started my own studio, I had to actually go out and buy toilet paper for the employees. So it's like the perfect analogy for me that you have to sort of care about all the details, everything around, not just creating the games, but about making sure the whole studio keeps rolling. There's a process behind everything. I'll get back to the toilet paper. Don't worry about it. There'll be more toilet paper along the way. So I have 3 takeaways that I want to sort of impart on you today. Process is product. The journey is the destination. I'll talk more about it. Working with tight constraints can sometimes be the best way to accomplish your vision. Coloring within the lines of something. And again, I'll expand on this. And plans are worthless, planning is everything. It was actually this guy who said that. Well, apparently there are guys before him that also said it. This is Eisenhower. And that's, of course, he was talking about waging war. And game development is not quite waging war, although it's quite close. Not war on the players, but sort of more war on all the problems that happen every day. And when we say plans are worthless, planning is everything, is that it's important to plan. It's really, really important. But emergencies and unexpected stuff happens every single day. And you can't really plan for that. So you have to then make your plans over again, and you have to keep doing that. Worst case, you revise your plan every week, every day. But that's part of it. You still have to plan, but then you have to be willing to throw it away. There are going to be emergencies. So those are the three takeaways. Those are the three sort of main things I'll talk about. Process is the product, constraints inspire creativity, and keep your plans dynamic. But this is supposed to be about a box. That was the name of the presentation. I feel sort of I have to get back to that. But this is important too. This is sort of the way we think, the way I think about creating games is to define the constraints. Define the, let's not call them limitations, but at least that's why I call it the box. The box that we are able to do. It's a shape, it's a locked shape. It had constraints, it contains a quantity of something. It sets clear conditions on us as designers and creators. Conditional design is a phrase I'll be mentioning a couple of times. And conditions require processes. So there are two ways to approach making games, again, from my point of view. Process-oriented versus product-oriented. And I believe that product is born of process. And process is anything from prototyping. I know there was a talk about that earlier here today. It's about brainstorming. It is about iterating. It's about agile development. It is about constantly questioning what you're doing and revisiting it. Everything you do should be about that process. You know sort of where you're heading, but the product is made along the way. And I think most good games, most great games, they're not defined at the outset. There's not a document that says exactly what this game is going to be. There is an idea, and then along the way, the process changes that idea, and it becomes the product, the game. Of course, no one can play a process. You play the content, you play the product, but the process is about how we develop it. Product is what, and the process is how. And game development is about defining the what through the how. Process is also about being flexible. If you're product-oriented, you're not flexible. You're probably thinking again to a certain spec. You have the map, you have the plan. You're just going through the motions in order to create that thing. And I've done that. And I know in some cases you have to. If it's work for order, somebody else decides the budget, the spec, the design. You know, the product is set, but there can still be a process there. But if you're liberated, if you have the ability to define the product, doing it through process. It's about rigid versus loose, right? The product is rigid, the process is loose. There's something called conditional design manifesto, and you guys can look this up. And it's partly bullshit, but there's some really cool stuff in here that I really like. So it's about cherry picking what's in there. And they talk about rules as constraints. And constraints sharpen the perspective on the process and stimulate play within the limitations. I don't know why you guys, but if I can just have a wide open playing field and we can do anything and unlimited money and unlimited resources, that's actually not necessarily a great way to start. Sometimes the best way to start is to just limit yourself. Put yourself inside that box, set up the walls and set the constraints, and then work from there. These guys talk about coloring inside the lines. I'm not super happy about that way of talking about it, because that sounds like you don't have any freedom. But it's about constraining the freedoms you have, and that can actually be very freeing. That can actually be very liberating. So, in terms of processes, everything we do in game development is a process. Idea creation. When we work on new ideas, it's a process. We can spend a whole day and we can start with what we think is going to be the game, and at the end of the day, we have something completely different. We have a process around it, with pitching, with discussing, with arguing, with thinking we have a great idea and then thinking about suddenly all the problems associated with that idea. Idea creation is a process. Design is a process, of course. You go through multiple iterations on what you do. You have to test what you do. You have to sort of get feedback on what you do. Design is all about the process. Prototyping, obviously, a process. The same with development. Development is almost an endless series of prototypes until you just land on something that you think is the final prototype, the one you can actually ship. And the same with post-production. Great content requires a process, but process in itself is not content. And that's, don't be fooled by that. You're not going to end up with a great game just by thinking process, by constantly iterating. You do need to create content out of it that is driven by vision, driven by an understanding of what players will enjoy. A process is about setting constraints, about designing, iterating, and implementing within those constraints, about building, and we're back to the box. But I've been talking a lot about the technical processes and those things, and I'll get back to a little bit of why I am talking about that and where I'm coming from. So that's me. I always enjoyed telling stories. That was my greatest joy. Writing, drawing, telling other kids stories, usually horror stories. My parents were actually told by the parents of the other kids to, stop me from telling horror stories because I was scaring the shit out of them. But I enjoyed it. I enjoyed the feedback. I enjoyed the sort of the relation between storyteller and audience. And when I discovered computers, and this was the first one I worked with, then I found a new way to create stories that people could interact with. So I taught myself to make games, mostly because my parents didn't give me any games, so I had to actually make them. So I made 100 games until I discovered the joys of pirate copies, and then I stopped making games, and I started playing a lot more games. I discovered adventure games. This is Zork. This is one of the first adventure games I played, a text adventure. Then I got something called the Quill, which allowed me to start making adventure games on my own by writing text and writing interactions. And through all of that, I sort of grew to really be interested in the medium. But my first love was movies, and especially horror movies. So I stopped making games, I stopped playing games, and I went to film school. And I learned more about storytelling and visual storytelling. I also felt that games weren't really able to engage and grip people at this point. The audio visuals weren't great enough. There was, poor graphics, poor sound. I didn't really feel that games was a great storytelling medium yet. So I went to film school. The intent was to have a career in film. But then CD-ROM arrived, and I got an internship at a company making a game called The Snow Arrow, which was never released. But that game had orchestral music and voiceovers. John Hurt was in it. It had beautiful art, beautiful animations. And suddenly I realized that you can tell great stories with games. You can use this medium, especially with the advent of CD-ROM. That was, a fantastic opportunity to join from the beginning of a whole new medium. So I joined Funcom. Yep, that's me. A very long time ago. This is in 1994. We are visiting Disney in LA, I think. Well, this was just when I was starting to work on a game based on the Casper movie that came out in 1995 or something like that. If you haven't seen it, don't see it. We were handed basically just a script to the movie. We had a meeting with the director, and then we made a game. I was not able to come up with a solution for having Casper walk through walls. So this is a ghost game where the walls stop you. I'm not proud of that design, but still one of my best-selling games. Go figure. I was also able to work on the PlayStation 1. And my latest game is on PlayStation 4, so I sort of feel like I followed the whole PlayStation thing, except I never made anything for PlayStation 2 or PlayStation 3. I jumped from the beginning to the end. I created or helped create a bunch of games at Funcom, including Anarchy Online, Longest Journey, Dreamfall, and The Secret World. And The Longest Journey is a game that was designed from the get-go. It's designed like a product in a way, not in a bad way. I wrote a whole big script, I wrote all the puzzles, I wrote all the backstory, and then just told the team we're making this game, and then we made that game. And it took twice as long as it should have. And we ended up having to change quite a lot along the way, because you have to, especially when you're trying to be so rigid with what you're making. And we kept rewriting the ending, for example. The ending wasn't set until a few months before launch. So that game taught me a lot. And it's a game I'm proud of having worked on. So after I ended working at Funcom, I created Red Thread Games. We went on Kickstarter with a game called Dreamfall Chapters. We made $1.5 million on Kickstarter, and we were able to actually hire a team, start working on it. And we had huge ambitions, of course, as we all do. We're going to make a 10-hour full 3D adventure that sort of followed up on the story of The Longest Journey and the original Dreamfall game. But things, happened along the way. And at a certain point, we realized we weren't going to be able to do what we originally planned. We had to take a step back. We had to sort of figure out a process rather than just, again, pushing to make a product. Otherwise, we'll just end up being out of toilet paper permanently. And, before Red Thread Games, there was always money. There was always sort of idea that even if you were delayed, there was going to be funding. With Dreamfall Chapters and Red Thread Games, that wasn't the case. If we ran out of money, then we were out of a job and we didn't have a game to work on. So, we took a step back and we realized that we weren't going to be able to accomplish what we originally did. We had a game that was much bigger than what we'd originally planned. And we decided to go episodic and then to launch the first episode, which was a 6-hour-long episode on the original release date, but then extending the whole production to over a year. And that was a really good decision. And that allowed us to work on coming up with processes. Instead of having one release, we now have 5 releases. And with every release, we learned so much about making games. From idea creation, through design, through implementation, to launch 5 times. And that was something that really, really helped us, both in terms of surviving as a studio, but also as, learning more about how we see games and how we see game development. So we completed Dreamfall Chapters. We didn't do it in 12 months, we did it in 18 months. The last episode came out in June 2016, and the console version in May of this year. And then we re-released the game in what we call the Final Cut edition this July, a couple of months ago. I play you guys a trailer from this one. So hopefully we have sound here. Can we dim the lights? so proud of what the team did on this game. For the most part, during most of production, there were only like 10, 12 people working on this. A game that, looks fantastic. I mean, it's a game with, of course, its own share of problems, but the fact that half of these guys managed to create that game is pretty unbelievable. So this is the team, almost the whole team now. We have a few more people since then. I'll show you guys a quick video of where we're located in Oslo to get a sense of who we are and where how far we've come. So our goal is to make games with soul, and we are constrained by resources. We're constrained by money and time. We only have 20 people. We do work with a lot of freelancers and outsourcing companies. And of course, we have a lot of ideas for what we want to do. We're very hungry. So our challenge is, how do we make all these ideas into games with soul? And that's basically what led to the concept or the philosophy behind the box. So like I said, it's a way of thinking about the creative production processes from idea to product, and how limiting freedom is freedom in itself, at least from our point of view, coloring within the lines, creativity within constraints. So this is a tool, but it's also mostly a philosophy. And you can fill this metaphorical box with whatever you want, as long as you decided what the box is. So how does this translate into something that's useful to you? Well, you have to find your box and how that is defined. It doesn't really matter how you define it. It is an exercise in creative constraints. But what I usually do, what we do, is to begin with scope. All of us have ideas. We're all creative. We can fill this box with stuff, but what's probably most important is to just narrow ourselves in terms of how long is it going to take? How much money do we have? What people do we have? Those three things, 3 dimensions, that is to me, a perfect box. Then you can actually begin to create. You've set the constraints. You know what you're able to, how much time you have, who you have to work on this game. But, you can look at it from lots of different points of view. The budget and timeline and people, it could be also set by the vision. That is the thing you want to create as a box. That's harder, because a vision can often be a grand thing. And to be able to constrain that is definitely harder than constraining yourself with the resources. Or it could be the design. It's a work for hire, or it's a very specific task you're trying to accomplish with this game. Then the design can become your box. These are all possible. But everything now has to fit inside the box you created, so you have to fill it smartly. Like I said, I start with basically this. This is a huge spreadsheet that tells me exactly how much money we're going to have, so I'm not going to spend too long looking at it. How much money we're going to have. Actually, a lot of these numbers are fake, so it doesn't matter. But this shows me all the expenses of the company, down to like lunch and office rent and cleaning of the offices. And that's actually the most important tool for me, to start with something that tells me, okay, if we put one more person on this project, then our bottom line is going to look like that. If we spend this much on Friday beers, then the budget is going to look like that. And that gives me a constant idea of the constraints for the games we're making. Then we work on a more individual level. Again, fake numbers. This is a budget for a specific project. And you start to look at that in terms of what can we actually afford, in terms of how many people and how much time. Again, we're building that box. And then lastly, we look at projected sales. We know if we spend this much money, how much money do we project we're going to come out on the other end? That's also part of the box we're creating. So, at least from my point of view, use budgets to build your box, use people to build your box. And of course, your core pillars and vision statement. You're not going to forget about the game. You're not going to forget about the content. But again, that's so defined by what you're actually able to make. And that box is freeing in a lot of ways. Once we know this, look, we have 12 months, we have 8 people, then it's so much easier to be creative, because then you can let yourself loose inside that box. Even if it's a small one, it doesn't matter. You know that whatever you do, as long as it fits, you can do it. Of course, there are going to be problems along the way, but at least you thought about it. And I think this goes for being creative in a lot of ways, like being a painter and having a canvas. You're constrained. You sort of know the limitations of what you can do. You have your paints, your brushes, and your canvas. And I think a lot of people who make games, or a lot of people who start to make games, don't have the canvas or don't have the box. And there's too much freedom, and that can be a bad thing. I'm not going to spend much time on this, but I just wanted to briefly talk about how we use the box at Red Thread Games to come up with the projects we're working on now. So one of them is called Svalbard. It's a story-driven survival RPG in a polar punk post-apocalyptic future, sort of like a Nordic Mad Max meets Breath of the Wild. And what we did there is we started with basically the budget and the people. We knew we had a couple of years to make this game. We knew we had these kinds of people. And from there, we can then start to shape what kind of game can we make. We defined some pillars, and then we put together a little video. This is all really old stuff, by the way, so the game doesn't look like this now. This video is a year and a half old. But this was an exercise again in trying to see, is our box appealing to people? So we made that with 3 people in 2 weeks, I think. Again, as part of sort of defining what we're going to make. And that's part of our box too. We'll use this and we'll look at this and say, this is what we're making. This is our sort of vision for the game. I don't have a lot of time left, so I'm not going to go into the same stuff on the other game we're working on to any great extent. But we did pretty much the same thing there. We sort of came up with with a vision statement for the game. We came up with the core pillars for the game, and then we built the demo. And I'm not going to, unfortunately, show you that now, but again, I just wanted to illustrate a little bit of how we use these methods at Red Thread Games in order to create our games. So, to reiterate and conclude, process is product, the journey is the goal. Working with tight constraints can be the best way to accomplish the vision. I really, really believe that, and it served us well. And again, plans are worthless, planning is everything. I still buy toilet paper, although we are hiring an office manager now, so I might not have to anymore. We do still struggle with releasing on time, but at least now we're able to scope properly and to change along the way. And thinking inside the box, sort of, has helped shape how we make games, hopefully for the better. Yeah, that's all I have to say.